Los Angeles, 1992. There's a restaurant called The Ivory where half the industry goes to pretend money isn't real. Deals get made there over grilled fish and a bottle of white wine that costs more than most people's rent. Today, 3 men sit down for lunch. One of them weighs about 120 pounds. One of them is close to 280. The third runs the biggest music company in America. By the time these 3 stand up from this table, they've quietly agreed to build a machine. Not just a label, not just an album, a machine. A machine that would generate hundreds of millions of dollars, that would launch 4 of the best-selling rap albums of all time, and that will leave 2 men dead. This is an episode about war, but not the one that made the magazine covers. We were told it was East Coast versus West Coast. That's what the headline sold us. But when you follow the paperwork instead of the disses, you find out something else. The truth was always more expensive. In this episode, we're going to follow every dollar we can trace. From a federal prison to a boardroom to the streets where 2 rappers lost their lives. The machine never stopped running. Fast forward to 1998. The Los Angeles Times run a profile with the headline that sounds almost casual. Back in the club. The story isn't about Suge Knight. It's not about Jimmy Iovine. It's about a man most people in hip-hop have never heard of. John McClane. McClane is one of these people who makes the whole industry move without ever being famous. He comes from music on both sides of his family. His father ran the It Club, a jazz spot where Miles Davis and Coltrane played live. His mother was a pianist who showed up in movies with Lena Horne. He grew up backstage, watching talent, ego, and money collide. By the 1980s, McClane is working at A&M Records. He's the one who pairs Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis with the young Janet Jackson. The result is Control, one of the defining albums of that decade. That's his superpower. He connects the right people at the right time. 1990, Ted Field, heir to the Marshall Field department store fortune, decides he wants to start a label. His first call isn't to Jimmy Iovine, it's to John McClane. Field brings the money, McClane brings the ear and the relationships. Then Jimmy Iovine comes in, then Tom Waller. They call the new label Interscope. The first signings are Gerardo and Marky Mark. The records move some units, but nobody at the major is losing sleep over Interscope yet. That changes when McClane hears something new. A producer named Andre Young has just left NWA. He's in the studio working on a solo record. You know him as Dr. Dre. McClane hears the tapes and sees exactly what this could be. But before he can drag Dre all the way through the Interscope front door, before the corporate money shows up, somebody else quietly funds the dream. To see where the money comes from, you have to step away from the studios and into a federal prison. It's the fall of 1991 in downtown Los Angeles. If you want to understand Death Row's origin story, you start here. The visitors log at the Metropolitan Detention Center. On the visitors log, 2 names stand out. David Kenner, attorney, Marion Knight Jr., bodyguard, aspiring music executive. They're here to see inmate number 92132-011, Michael Harris. On the streets, people know him as Harry O. His story in the courts run across 2 separate systems. By the mid-1980s, a California court has convicted Harris on attempted murder and kidnapping charges, a state sentence of 25 years to life. While he was serving that time, federal prosecutors came after him separately. A federal indictment for large-scale drug trafficking added another 20 years on top. The combined weight of both cases is what puts him in that visiting room in 1991. and keeps him there for over 3 decades. Throughout the 1980s, investigators say Harris ran a large-scale trafficking network that stretched across 9 states. An underground operation some estimate was pulling in millions of dollars a day at its peak. The DEA seized roughly $3.2 million in cash and assets. But that wasn't everything. A lot of Harris' money was somewhere else the government couldn't reach. Suge Knight had an idea, a record label built around gangster rap. He wants to sign artists, book studio time, press records. What he doesn't have is startup capital. He needs $1.5 million. Harris agrees. In November of 1991, they formed a company called Godfather Entertainment. Death Row Records sits underneath it as a division. On paper, ownership is 50-50, Harris and Knight. There's one problem. California law doesn't allow prisoners to run businesses directly. So Harry O's wife, Lydia Harris, becomes the listed co-founder on the outside. She's the names on the documents. He's the one making the decisions. From that point on, Michael Harris is effectively running a label from behind bars, through visiting hours, through phone calls, through letters passed through David Kenner. Between August 1991 and February 1992, Kenner and Suge Knight come to see Harris 11 times. First at the Metropolitan Detention Center, then at Lancaster. Federal investigators document every visit. That $1.5 million is the seed money. It pays for the studio time, lawyers, offices, security, everything you need to turn an idea into a legitimate-looking label. Now Suge has capital. He can bring in Dre. He can book sessions and press CDs. And that's when John McClane finally hears the music he's been waiting for. The part the executives will put their names on is about to begin. The part that started it is still sitting in a prison cell. Early 1992, John McClane walks a rough demo into Interscope. Dr. Dre, a record called The Chronic. At first, it's a no. Too raw, too street, too much for a company that still has to answer to Time Warner. McClane waits. Months go by. The album gets finished. He brings it back. This time, he doesn't take no for an answer. Interscope agrees. $10 million for distribution and promotion. Death Row becomes part of the Interscope system. But underneath the clean corporate structure, underneath the logos and the board meetings, there is a layer nobody at the top wants to talk about. The seed money came from a federal inmate, from underground capital that started outside the system and got pulled inside. When the deal is done, David Kenner becomes Death Row's general counsel. Between 1992 and 1997, he earns about $13 million in legal fees from Death Row, more than any single artist on the label. December 1992, The Chronic is released. Michael Harris is still in prison. He never meets Dr. Dre, never meets Snoop Dogg, never meets Tupac Shakur. He's helped managing an empire from a visiting room and watching it grow on the evening news. Until, one day, the money stops. 3,000 miles away, a very different kind of deal is about to happen. New York, 1993. A 23-year-old A&R named Sean Combs has just been fired from Uptown Records. His mentor, Andre Harrell, made one phone call on his way out to Clyde Davis at Arista Records. Clyde Davis has already built more than one empire. Janis, Whitney, Aretha. He doesn't need hip-hop to be a legend, but he does need growth. So he does what the major labels have always done when a new sound scares them. He finances the people who understands it. Arista puts up the money. BMG handles the distribution. Sean Combs gets a label of his own. It's called Bad Boy Entertainment. 2 coasts, 2 labels. Both funded by older white executives at the top. Both built on the backs of young black entrepreneurs at the bottom. But there is a key difference. One model is corporate from day one. Boardrooms, budgets, clean paperwork. The other starts with street money, underground capital, and gets cleaned up later inside the system. Same structure, very different origins. By 1992, Interscope has money. Death Row has music. But neither of them has the thing that actually get albums into people's hands. Infrastructure. They can't personally ship millions of CDs into Walmart, into Sam Goody, into every mall in America. That's where Brian Turner comes in. He's a Canadian former K-Tel salesman, the guy who used to sell late-night compilation albums on TV. Now he runs Priority Records. Priority is already moving NWA, Eazy-E, and Ice Cube nationwide. Turner agrees to add Death Row to that pipeline, starting with The Chronic, then Doggy Style. Doggy Style becomes the first debut album in Billboard history to enter the Billboard 200 at #1, debuting with over 800,000 copies sold in 1 week, a record for any debuting artist at that time. The same warehouse is now shipping records from both sides of the NWA breakup. Eazy-E and Cube, Dre and Snoop, former partners, now enemies. Same middleman. Priority doesn't finance the music. They're not the label. But they are the reason The Chronic and Doggy Style become national events instead of regional classics. Street money, corporate money, distribution infrastructure. The machine is complete. And once a machine like this starts printing money, stopping it becomes more dangerous than letting it run. Now here's where it starts to fall apart. We're in 1996. Death Row has just put out All Eyes on Me, 10 million copies. The label is at the peak of everything it was supposed to be. And Michael Harris, the man who funded it all from a federal prison cell, stopped receiving his royalty payments. No explanation, no phone call, no letter from David Kenner. The payments just stopped. So Harris started writing a 15-page legal complaint, handwritten, laying out the full story. The $1.5 million, the Godfather Entertainment Agreement, the 50-50 ownership stake. The document names Suge Knight, David Kenner, and Interscope Records. Before it reaches a court, Interscope sees it. They settle quietly. Harris gets an undisclosed payment and signs a non-disclosure agreement. The lawsuit disappears. The story stays buried. For now. Before we get to how the machine breaks down, we have to go back and watch the moment it publicly announced itself to the world. August 3rd, 1995. The Source Awards, Madison Square Garden. This is the biggest night in hip-hop, the industry's version of the Oscars, except the fans are louder and the stakes are more personal. Death Row is now generating around $50 million a year. Suge Knight is the public face of it all. And somewhere in a California prison, Michael Harris is watching this on a television in a day room. Suge gets up to accept the award for Best Soundtrack, Above the Rim. And then he says something that nobody in the building is ready for. Any artist out there that wants to be an artist and wants a stage star and don't want to have to worry about the executive producer trying to be all in the videos, all on the record, dancing, come to Death Row. Everyone in that building knows who he's talking about. Sean Combs, Puffy, the man who is famously in his own artist videos, dancing. What made this hit different is something Combs reveals years later. He and Suge weren't enemies before that night. They were actually friendly. I really thought we were cool. When he said it, it was like, whoa. That's portrayal. And it landed in front of a hostile New York crowd. Combs keeps his composure that night. He doesn't respond from the stage. He makes what looks on paper like a smart business decision, but on the streets, it reads as weakness. And in hip hop in 1995, that's a dangerous thing to project. Think about what happens in the 24 months that followed that moment. Source Awards, August 1995. Time Warner announced it's selling Interscope, September 1995. Tupac walks out of prison, October 1995. Hit 'Em Up drops, June 1996. Tupac is shot and killed, September 1996. Biggie is shot and killed, March 1997. 24 months, 2 men dead. And every single week in between, the machine kept printing money. 3 weeks after the Source Awards, something happens that changes the corporate structure of hip-hop completely. And most fans had no idea it was happening at the time. Time Warner announces it's selling 50% stake in Interscope. The price, $115 million. The pressure had been building for months. Senators, preachers, activists, gangster rap had become a political issue. And Time Warner, a publicly traded media company with shareholders on a board, decided they didn't want the headache anymore. So they sell. Iveen and Phil buy back Time Warner's shares. Just like that, they own Interscope outright. No corporate parent to answer to. No board asking uncomfortable questions about the content they're distributing. Free agents. October 1995, Tupac Shakur walks out of Clinton Correctional Facilities after 8 months inside. The bail, $1.4 million. The story that spreads through hip-hop was simple. Suge Knight put up the money and freed Tupac. In exchange, Tupac agreed to record 3 albums for Death Row. That's the street version. 22 years later, Jimmy Iovine tells a different version in an HBO documentary. Time Warner wouldn't allow us to bail out Tupac. So what happened was we advanced Death Row the money, and Death Row bailed out Tupac. On paper, Suge Knight saved Tupac. In the financial records, according to Iveen, it was Interscope money that actually moved. Now, members of Tupac crew have pushed back on this account over the years, saying Iveen's version is incomplete and that Tupac's own funds were involved. What's not disputed is the result. Tupac signed to Death Row, records All Eyes on Me, and the label has its biggest year ever. But while all this is happening publicly, the man who seeded the whole operation is sitting in a cell, watching his royalty checks stop arriving. Harris writes his 15-page complaint. Interscope settles before it sees a courtroom. And then, almost immediately after, something interesting happens on the corporate side. Doug Morris calls Jimmy Iovine. January 1996, Morris, now installed as CEO of MCA, buys 50% of Interscope for $200 million. Here's what makes that interesting. Before Warner fired him in 1995, Morris was co-chair of Atlantic Records, one of Time Warner's flagship labels. He was in the room when the original Interscope deal was structured in 1992. Warner fires him. He lands at MCA, his first big move, by half of the company he helped build while he was at Warner. MCA eventually becomes Universal Music Group. The infrastructure never actually collapsed. It doesn't need to. It just changes the nameplate on the door and keeps climbing. While Tupac and Biggie are trading records, while fans on both coasts are picking sides and the media is turning a business dispute into a cultural war, Brian Turner is doing exactly what Brian Turner has always done: shipping. Think about that for a second. Priority is distributing The Chronic and Doggy Style for Death Row on the West Coast, America's Most Wanted and Death Certificate for Ice Cube, and in June of 1996, The Reasonable Doubt for a hungry Brooklyn rapper named Sean Carter, Jay-Z. Every major label has passed on Rockefeller. Priority was the only national distribution window that said yes. Brian Turner is making money off both sides of the NWA breakup, both coasts of the rap war, and the man who will go on to become the first hip-hop billionaire. 1997, Tupac is dead. Suge Knight is arrested and sentenced to 9 years in prison for violating his parole. Death Row starts to fall apart from the inside. In a last attempt to stabilize things, Death Row tries to walk and work directly with Priority, bypassing Interscope directly. They signed a deal for Nate Dogg's album and the gang-related soundtrack. But by the time that came around, the magic is gone. Dr. Dre has already left Death Row and started Aftermath Entertainment. Here's the thing though, when Dre leaves Death Row, he doesn't actually leave the building. Aftermath is still signed to Interscope. He just moved to a different floor of the same corporate structure. The house always wins. By the late 1990s, Brian Turner had sold Priority to EMI in stages, with the deal completing around 1998 for a reported $2 million. EMI folds Priority into Capitol Records operation. Turner walks away wealthy, quiet, and most completely unknown to the fans whose music he spent over a decade delivering to their front door. Let's actually count what this machine produced. 1992, The Chronic, around 6 million copies worldwide, certified triple platinum in the United States. 1993, Doggy Style, nearly 10 million copies worldwide. And it became the first debut album in Billboard charts history to enter at number 1, debuting over 800,000 copies sold in 1 week, a record for any debuting artist at the time. 1996, All Eyes on Me, 10 million copies, a double album, both discs released the same day. At its peak, Death Row was generating $150 million a year in revenue. On the East Coast, 1994, Ready to Die, 4 times platinum. 1997, No Way Out, 7 times platinum. Bad Boys 1998 revenue, approximately $130 million. Now here's what the fans were never watching. While the beef was dominating magazine covers and radio stations, while people were debating coasts and choosing sides, the money was flowing in one direction. Up to Universal, up to BMG, up to the same 3 or 4 corporate entities that owned everything. 1996, Combs renegotiated his deal with Arista. He gets $10 million and 50% ownership of Bad Boy Entertainment. 3 years later, Clyde Davis gives him a $50 million advance. Now that's how well this machine works. Even the entrepreneurs who were smart enough to build their own labels end up getting richer the longer they stayed inside the system. And then there's Michael Harris, 2005, 9 years after his quiet settlement with Interscope. A civil court awards Harris $107 million. The judgment confirms what he's been saying since 1991. He co-founded Death Row with the $1.5 million in seed money. Suge Knight can't pay. Death Row declares bankruptcy. Remember the drawing from episode 1? The 17 faces? Let's actually follow where each one ends up. Eminem, Aftermath, Interscope, Universal. Dr. Dre, Aftermath, Interscope, Universal. Snoop Dogg, Death Row, Interscope, Universal. Tupac, Death Row, Interscope, Universal. Eve, Roughwire, Interscope, Universal. Jay-Z, Rockefeller, Priority, then Def Jam, Universal. LL Cool J, Def Jam, Universal. Slick Rick, Def Jam, Universal. Redman, Def Jam, Universal. Biggie, Bad Boy, Arista, BMG. Puffy, Bad Boy, Arista, BMG. 13 of the 17 faces from the illustration end up feeding the same corporate parent by the end of the 1990s. The war was real on the streets. At the corporate level, it was a family argument. Different subsidiaries, same parent company. Before we wrap up, I want to take a minute to step outside the spreadsheets, because this story has numbers inside it. Billions of dollars, percentage points, corporate hierarchy. But it also has names. Tupac Amaru Shakur, 25 years old. Christopher George Wallace, 24 years old. Now let's look at the people who signed the checks. Jimmy Iovine sold Beats by Dre to Apple in 2014 for $3 billion. Still producing, still in the industry. Clyde Davis still hosts the most exclusive pre-Grammy parties in the music business every February. Still active as a music executive in his 90s. Doug Morris, the only executive in the history of the recorded music industry to run Warner, Universal, and Sony. Retired, wealthy. John McClane, the man who connected all the dots at the beginning. Now he managed the Michael Jackson estate, one of the most valuable music catalogs in existence. Brian Turner, by the late 1990s, he had sold Priority Records to EMI for a reported $200 million, completing one of the quietest exits in the history of music industry. Comfortable, private, and almost entirely unknown. Suge Knight, in prison. He received a 28-year sentence in 2018 for voluntary manslaughter. As of this year, he's serving year 11. Michael Harris, Harry O. He spent 33 years in federal prison. In January 2021, the current president included him in a round of pardons on his last day in office. 2022, Snoop Dogg purchases Death Row Records. He brings Harris back in as chief operating officer. The man who co-founded the label from a visiting room in 1991 is now running it again, legally, publicly, and free. But he never met Dr. Dre, never sat in the same room as Tupac, never shook Snoop's hand until 30 years after he wrote the check that made Snoop's careers possible. And Sean Combs, he's fighting for his legacy right now, but on a very different front than anything we've covered in this episode. That's a story for another time. Tupac and Biggie were drawn in 1994 by Andre Leroy Davis for The Source magazine. Characters, frozen at the ages they will always be, 25 and 24. When people say East Coast versus West Coast, they're usually describing what they saw on the surface. The beef was real. The disses were real. The funerals were real. But what was underneath all of it was actually powered the conflict and then profited from it all. structural. Interscope and Arista found out how to turn conflict into product. Priority made sure that the product reached every mall in America. Death Row was seeded with off-the-books capital, managed from inside a federal prison, and then laundered into legitimacy through a series of corporate partnerships nobody was asking hard questions about. But here's the part that should stay with you. Nobody at Interscope sat Suge down and told him to humiliate Puff at the Source Awards. Nobody at Arista called Tupac and said, "We need you to record Hit 'Em Up." Nobody at Priority told Biggie to write a response. But nobody stopped it either. Because stopping it would have slowed the machine. And the machine was printing money. Conflict sold records. Diss tracks went platinum. The artists who died became martyrs. Martyrs became legends. Legends became catalog value. And catalog value belongs to whoever owns the masters. Go back to the lunch. Los Angeles, 1992. Jimmy Iovine, Suge Knight, and Doug Morris sitting down for grilled fish and white wine. Doug Morris had told this story publicly, like it's a funny memory from a long career. Iovine leaned over to him before Suge arrived and said, "When I wink at you, tell him I'm a genius." Morris winked on cue. Suge believed it. The deal closed. Everyone laughed. The word genius gets used a lot in this story. It applies to the executives, the deal makers, the men who structured the agreements and built the pyramids. But here's what I want to leave you with. Dr. Dre made The Chronic. Biggie made Ready to Die. Tupac made All Eyes on Me. Those are works of geniuses. Everything else is distribution. Next time, episode 4, The Women Behind the Thrones. Faith Evans, Michelle A., Kim Porter, Eve, the relationships that held the empire together. The women who were never in the drawing, but whose stories are the ones that actually explain everything else. If you made it this far, thank you. Subscribe if you haven't already. Episode 4 is going to be one that people weren't expecting.